Hello and namaste friends. A very warm welcome to Ansarkari. I am Vikas Bhartwaj. Very important lecture we are going to cover today. Before coming to the First World War, we have already formed the base for understanding why we have reached this situation. If you think critically for a moment, you will be able to understand that we have covered all important facts, topics, data and everything which are actually helpful in understanding कि Second World War हुआ क्यों. Let's understand. Here I am giving you a complete timeline. Take a screenshot or take a printout of the same, because from understanding how from August 1939 the non-aggression pact between Germany and Soviet Union, we are going to understand events till September 1945. Whether it is Germany, whether it is UK, whether it is France, whether it is US or even Japan. Very important events of the Second World War, very important. You must remember them by heart. Questions will be asked in the prelims and maybe in the interview, and also certain understanding will help you in the mains. So let's tighten our seat belts and take the journey for understanding the Second World War with complete concentration. The principal belligerents were Axis powers. As we know, Germany, Italy and Japan are known as Axis powers. Allied powers, France, Great Britain, US, Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent China is also allied power, not like today. This is the situation of Axis and Allied powers. Axis power countries are shown with the yellow mark and the Allied power countries are shown with the green mark. What do you think about India at the same time? Think about Australia, think about Brazil and so forth. Do have a very quick and important look. Now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, you have to understand, this is also playing a very important role. So that is how the Axis powers of 1942, you can see over here and you can see over here. Because examination may be asking you later on the exact positions. If you have in your mind, you can create a SWOT map also in the mains exam. Let's see the causes first. Economic problems caused by the Locarno spirit. We have already understood. Affairs were dominated by the three aggressive powers, Japan, Italy and Germany. Their extreme nationalism. We have already discussed that also. Breaching of the international agreements. We have discussed in detail in our previous lecture. Japan becoming the first major aggressor with its successful invasion of the eastern part of China known as Manchuria in 1931. Both Hitler and Mussolini took note of the failure of League of Nations to curb Japanese aggression, and that's why they became more confident. Hitler began cautiously by announcing reintroduction of conscription in 1935. It led to formation of Stresa Front among Britain, France and Italy. The Stresa Front was only short-lived due to Anglo-German Naval Agreement and Italy's successful invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. So बहुत जगह बहुत कुछ हो रहा है and we have to understand. Hitler sending troops into Rhineland in 1936, and what we have to see is that the Rome-Berlin axis is going to be very powerful, and the anti-Comintern pact with Japan in 1936 at the same time, and the Spanish Civil War breaking out. So Hitler and Mussolini, they will be carrying out attacks and they will be sending help to the Franco, the nationalist leader, in 1937. The Japanese are going to embark on a full-scale invasion of North China, and we have already seen and discussed that how the Union of Australia in 1938 will be there. Austria will be demanding that we must be actually united with Sudetenland. We want this. Appeasement policies of British will be there, as we have discussed in the Munich 1938, in which it was agreed that Germany should have Sudetenland, but Hitler annexed Czechoslovakia. So lot of events are taking place, and after signing a non-aggression pact with Russia in 1939, Germans invaded Poland also. Britain and France, they will be declaring war on Germany. So these basic events are very important, and the changes are very important to understand why the Second World War started. Again I am repeating, Anglo-German Naval Agreement, दोनों बात कर लेते हैं, मान जाते हैं. And I have discussed in my previous lecture how every country was expecting that Germany must not supersede them in terms of naval fleet. Hitler also was aware of the fact that this is the beginning of a potential UK-German alliance against the USSR. But Britain was seeing it very differently. It was seeing it is a way to limit German armament. But the same was not seen by the Germany. It will be controversial definitely because it will be enabling Germany to build a navy bigger than what was limited. It was also seen as a betrayal of the recently signed Stresa Pact by Italy and France because now Italy was free to act unilaterally against Abyssinia. And as we have discussed in the lecture of depression, when we were talking about economic depression, that how the economic and foreign policies in this time period of 6 years, like on 16th March 1935, Hitler announced the reintroduction of conscription. Able-bodied men who turn 19, 1 lakh people, more than that, they will be recruited and trained each year through officially. This is where MASH, the size would remain 1 lakh in the line with Versailles. That is what they promised, but they didn't do it. Again, as I just discussed, that the Spanish Civil War, Spain between the communists who were supporters of the Republican government and the right-wing rebels who will be supported by Hitler and Mussolini, General Franco. Hitler will be getting an opportunity to fight against communism. And then again, anti-Comintern pact against again communism. The Italians will also be heavily involved in Spanish Civil War because Hitler and Mussolini, they are both seeing many things common. Similarly, there will be military dictatorship in Japan. In 1936, Japan and Germany, they will sign anti-Comintern pact and Italy will also be part of it. And at the same time, as we have seen that how Japan will be controlling Manchuria. So this is the time of conflict of different ideologies. The whole world is actually under the spell of different ideologies. When we say whole world, forget about colonies because they are not the one, they are the pawns. So the old Habsburg Empire of the new states of Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Old Russian Empire, which was having Poland, Finland, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. All of them adopted written constitutions with their legislatures elected through universal adult franchise or suffrage. But do the real situation was same or different? That is the whole point. Everyone was living in nostalgia, whether it is Austria or whether it is Russian Empire. Germany also adopted a constitution we have discussed called Weimar Republic. Ottoman Empire, a nationalist revolution, was going to abolish the Sultanate, you know, and the Caliphate. And it also, on paper, established a secular democratic Republic of Turkey. The first Muslim country to separate religion from government was Turkey, you know, Ataturk, Kemal Pasha. 1920s, which is showcasing democratic advances and establishment of democracy in different parts of the world because the voting systems were extended both in Britain and the US in these times. India was also fighting its right. Now, these ideological conflicts, which we have just discussed, what is happening in Russia, what is happening in Germany, what is happening in Italy, what is happening in Turkey, US, and so forth, it is going to divide world into two groups. Now, that's why Mussolini said the struggle between two worlds can permit no compromise, either we or they. America, England, and France, who believed in the democratic principles but with their selfish motives, they prepared themselves to give setback to this ideology of Mussolini. The harsh Paris settlement, we have already discussed harsh Paris settlements. Because of these settlements, the bitter divisions will be there. Endless conflict will be there after First World War. And European nations and US, they will be retreating themselves into isolationism. अपना बस घर ठीक हो जाए. US did not even join the League of Nations. Think about what other world bodies are there which US is not part of. Germany will be witnessing Hitler capitalizing on economic distress, discontent, and he will be seizing absolute power and begin constructing his Third Reich. His aggressive military moves to reclaim German territory and to conquer all of Europe will be one of the reasons for the Second World War. So the 3 years, as we have discussed, one, Spanish Civil War, the union of Germany and Austria, Hitler's occupation of the southern land, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. this will be led to deterioration of ties between Axis power and allied powers. बस बहुत हो गया. One power is not ready to give any space to other power. Other power is saying मैं ही लुट गया. So German invasion of Poland on 1st September 1939, and the 2 days later Britain and France declaring war on Germany as if everybody was ready. And in the east, Finland was attacked by USSR in 1939. Think of why NATO today and how it behaves. Think of what is there at the root of Ukraine-Russia war. The League of Nations, it expelled the Russians, it expelled the Russians, and the Finland had gained independence from Russia during the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War 1917 and 1918-20 respectively. Russia did not occupy the whole of Finland but forced it to cede a large part of its territory. Only those areas were taken away from Finland which would help Russia deal with the attack from the west. In 1940, Russia invaded and occupied the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, which were taken away from it by the Germans under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk 1917, and then made independent states under the Treaty of Versailles. Now Stalin wanted them back under the Russian fold. The winter war between Russia and Finland concluded in March 1940, and in the following month Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered immediately, but Norwegian fought on with the British and French assistance, surrendering only in June 1940. खेल हुआ है. So you see, this is the winter war, and see how the battles were being fought. So the Second World War is actually a very, very tragic and also a very, very consequential learning from the for the future world. Like 1914 to 1918 war, the Second World War will not be slow. It will be a war of rapid movement. Today is the war of space and drones. It was a more complex affair. And the major campaigns will be taking place in Pacific and the Far East, in North Africa, and also in the deep hearts of Russia, as well as Central and Western Europe along with Atlantic. So the four clearly defined phases we will discuss. The opening move, September 1939 to December 1940, Germans and Russians had occupied Poland, and after a 5-month pause known as the Phony War, German forces occupied Denmark and Norway by April 1940. And in May 1940, attacks were made on Holland and Belgium and France. They were also defeated, leaving Britain alone to face the dictators. Hitler's attempt to bomb Britain into submission was thwarted in the Battle of Britain that is taking place between July to September 1940. But Mussolini's army, they invaded Egypt and Greece. So you see, this is what is happening in the Second World War. And Second World War is the creation of these powers only and not of the rest of the world. But the question arises, why French were defeated so quickly? Because French were psychologically unprepared for the war. They were bitterly divided between left and right. The right was fascist in sympathy and admired Hitler's achievement in Germany and wanted an agreement with them. Communists, the following things which were happening and the non-aggression pact between Germany and USSR, they were also against the war. They also believed that no, this is not possible. So the long period of inaction during the Phony War allowed time for peace party to develop on the right, headed by Level. Now what was his argument? That there is no point in continuing war now that the Poles whom they were supposed to be helping had been defeated. गए तो गए भाई पोलैंड, हम क्या करें, बहुत हो गया, अब आगे अब मामला नहीं बढ़ेगा. So you are not again understanding, one can say, the real situation. So the Second World War, as I can show you from this graphic representation, was something which world had never seen before. And whole Germany, I mean to say whole Europe, was completely devastated by it. As far as French is concerned, they made some fatal mistakes. No attempt was made to help Poland by attacking Germany in the west, because they could have attacked Germany in the west in September 1939 and they had a good chance, but they were not ready. No troops were moved from the Maginot Lines forts, which were inactive, to help block German breakthrough on the river Meuse. Poor communication between army and air force was also the reason, and the air defense forces of Germany, they were much more smarter. Military defeat gave the defeatist the right chance to come out in the open and put pressure on the government to accept a ceasefire. So, when even the 84-year-old Pétain, the hero of the Verdun in 1916, urged peace, Prime Minister Renaud resigned and Pétain took over. So, French people and the French government were themselves responsible. Now, next chance was of Britain. This was fought in air because when Goering's Luftwaffe they tried to destroy the Royal Air Force as a preliminary invasion of the Britain was able to ward it off. Germans bombarded harbors, radar stations, aerodromes, and munition factories. And by September, they started bombing London. And in retaliation, Britain Air Force will be raiding actually Berlin. So the RAF inflicted heavy losses on Luftwaffe because there were more than 1,389 German planes which were lost, and British only lost 792 planes. So British air power was far from being destroyed. It will be known to Hitler only later on because Hitler believed that he is going to win, but then finally he will be calling off the invasion. British people, British acumen, British technology, it all helped. New radar stations gave penalty of warning of approaching German attackers. German bombers were poorly armed. They were fatigued. They were too much tired. Though the British fighters like Spitfires and Hurricanes were there, they were not significantly better than the Germans' Messerschmitts. Germans were hampered by the limited range because they could only carry fuel. Enough fuel only enabled them to stay in power or stay in, I should say, sky for 90 minutes. So real reasons were there. And the switching to bombing of London was a mistake because it relieved the pressure on the airfields. So the Battle of Britain was probably the first major turning point of the war, one can say. For the first time, the Germans had been checked and demonstrating the fact that they were not invincible. Britain was able to remain in the struggle, thus facing Hitler, who was about to attack Russia, with the fatal situation of the war on two fronts. One side you have Russia, other side you have the UK. As Churchill remarked when he paid tribute to the British fighter pilots, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. It is very true, and you can always quote this in your essay and also in ethics, maybe in the changing context. So you see, Battle of Britain, very, very important, and a significant, not just an event, it's a milestone. It is not just a lesson, it is a complete chapter. Battle of Britain, again in details, you can see forth how planning was being done. So the Axis offensive is going to widen because they were now desperate. 1941 to the summer of 1942. War now began to develop into worldwide conflict. Hitler, who was very confident of the quick victory of Britain, launched an invasion of Russia, June 1941. He wanted to break the non-aggression pact. Japanese forced USA into the war by attacking the American naval base at the Pearl Harbor, and they followed this up by occupying territories such as Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. So war seemed to be no way of stopping the Germans and Japanese, though Italians were less successful at the same time. This what it teaches about the international relations. We have to be self-reliant. We have to be powerful. We have to be, sagacious. That is the only way in the longer run. German invasion of Russia, which is called Operation Barbarossa, began in June 22, 1941. Hitler's motives have been mixed. He feared that Russians might attack Germany. He was fearful, while his forces were still occupied on the west. He also believed and hoped the Germans will be successful or helpful when Japanese would be attacking Russia in the Far East. The more powerful Japan, the less chances was of the USA entering the war. That was the belief of Hitler. And there was hatred for communism in his mind. And his desire for Lebensraum, the living space, the expansion with the great Aryan race demands. According to historian Alan Bullock, Hitler invaded Russia for the simple and sufficient reason that has always meant to establish the foundations of his thousand-year Reich by annexing territory lying between Vistula and the Urals. Just go and check out in the atlas. It has sometimes been suggested that the attack on Russia was Hitler's greatest mistake. But in fact, huge Trevor Roper, they pointed out that Hitler To Hitler, the Russian campaign was not a luxury. It was to be all and end all of Nazism. It couldn't be delayed. It was now or never. Hitler did not expect a long war. When he told one of his generals, "We have only one kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come out crashing down." The German attack was threefold: north Leningrad, center Moscow, and the south through Ukraine. So that is how one can understand the Second World War was something unimaginable. You have to remember the name of events, you have to remember the key phrases, and obviously what each event is making you feel. Because Operation Barbarossa, as you can see, it will be also a changing point, a game point. It also involved a kind of a secret invasion. That's how the Germany's was looking forward to stopping and also winning the war as soon as possible. Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad. That is the point which were to be attacked. Now, the planned division of Central Europe, which is going to be there because of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we will also see that. Please do have a look at the different location of the different countries. So the offensives were held in check, and by September 1942 to summer of 1943, what one can say is that situation was changing. Three important battles in which Axis were defeated from summer 1942 to summer of 1943. In June 1942, Americans drove off a Japanese attack on Midway Island. Very important. There is a documentary on Netflix also. In October, the Germans under Rommel advancing towards Egypt were halted at El Amin and later driven out of North Africa. The third battle was in Russia. By September 1942, Germans had penetrated as far as Stalingrad on the river Volga. Here the Russians put up such fierce resistance that in the following February, German army was surrounded and forced to surrender. So how you think of in the present times that Russia is going to, back off as far as Ukraine war is concerned? It has a great history. On November 26, 1941, Japanese will be attacking Pearl Harbor. They will be leaving for Pearl Harbor. And by December 1941, US is actually entering the Second World War. Americans assisted the Chinese who were still in war with Japan when the Japanese persuaded Vichy France to allow them to occupy French into China because there were military bases over there. President Roosevelt demanded their withdrawal and placed an embargo on oil supplies to Japan in July 26, 1941. Negotiations were carried out. Japanese tried to persuade Americans to lift the embargo, but the stalemate was reached when the Americans insisted on Japanese withdrawal from both Indochina and from China itself. That is how the aggressive General Tojo, who became Prime Minister on October 16, war seemed inevitable. And the attack was brilliantly organized by Admiral Yamamoto. There was no declaration of war. 353 Japanese planes arrived in undetected at Pearl Harbor and in 2 hours destroyed 350 aircraft and 5 battleships. 3,700 men were killed or seriously injured, and Roosevelt called 7 December a date which will live in infamy. That is how the Pearl Harbor is going to have a great results. It gave Japanese control of the Pacific, and by May 1942 they had captured Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong and Burma. These all were part of the British Empire, and Indians were also believing that Japanese will be coming to India and now we will be colonized by Japan. The Dutch East Indies, Philippines and the 2 American possessions like Guam and Wake Island, they were also to be part of it. And because Japanese were doing so much, Hitler also declared war on the USA. So Japan gets an army premier. That's how the news came. You can see the role of newspapers in the US and also in Japan. And then just try to see location of ships in the Pearl Harbor. Japanese attack on December 7, 1941. High-level bombers, torpedo planes, and the dive bombers. You see how they are coming up. First wave, second wave, and how they are going to shock the US. Pearl Harbor attack. This is Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Honolulu, and the game will be changed. Stalingrad, let's talk about it in very brief. The southern prong of the German invasion of Russia. And Germany had penetrated so deeply through the Crimea, it went on to capture Rostov-on-Don and was finally be confronting the Russian army. So now you think of why Russia had taken up Crimea. The Germans had reached Stalingrad by the end of 1942, that is August 1942, but they had more or less destroyed the city. But Russians were not ready to surrender. There were counterattacks in a ferocious manner, trapping the Germans, whose supply line was dangerously extended in a large pincer movement. So, with his retreat cut off, German commander von Paulus had no reasonable alternative but to surrender with 94,000 men. If Stalingrad had fallen, the supply route for Russia's oil from the Caucasus would have been cut off, and the Germans had hoped to advance up to the river Don to attack Moscow from the southeast. This plan was abandoned. But more than this was at stake. The defeat was a catastrophe for the Germans. It shattered the myth that Germans were invincible and boosted the Russian morale and morale of the Allied forces. They followed up with more counterattacks in July 1943. There was a great tank battle at Kursk, which forced Germans to retreat. Early in 1944, Germans had to abandon the siege of Leningrad and to retreat from their position west of Moscow. It was only a matter of time before the Germans, heavily outnumbered and short of tanks and guns, they were driven out of Russia. So very important, the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle between July and August 1943. So these events, you can understand, are going to change the destiny of not only Europe and Asia but of the rest of the world. The Axis power were defeated finally when the time period between July 1942 to August 1945 it reflected enormous power and resources which were used by the US and USSR and combined along with that of Britain and also other powers like French. The Axis power were in danger. Italy was eliminated first, and this was followed by the Anglo-American invasion of Normandy, which liberated France, Belgium, and Holland. Later, Allied troops crossed the Rhine and captured Cologne, and in the east, Russians drove the Germans out and advanced on Berlin via Poland. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and in August 1945, after the Americans had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and also in Nagasaki, the Second World War ended. Now let's try to see very quickly what were the impacts of the Second World War and what was the role and impact on contemporary colonies. Because it accelerated the decline of colonialism, it was a tipping point for independence movements. It strained European empires financially and militarily. They exposed vulnerabilities and chipped away the image of invincibility. Now it emboldened colonized people to fight for their self-rule, and the national movements also got more power, more courage. Many colonies supplied resources and manpower to the war effort, and they were actually got aware of the fact that there is no point of the big power being ruling us. We must be carrying out our own destiny. The Japanese victories were temporary in nature because in Southeast Asia they challenged the idea of European colonial dominance and they inspired independence movements in the region, but then they were not able to provide an alternative. So ideals versus reality. The war's brutality, it contradicted Europeans' justification for colonialism. You can always write in your answers. Spreading civilization and the ideas of democracy is about not just preaching them, but to practice it. This hypocrisy fueled calls for self-determination. And at the same time, there will be rise of the two great powers, USA and USSR as superpower. And the balance of power will be shifting. US, unlike European powers, it it supported decolonization efforts because it also wanted that Comintern, or you can say communist ideas, must not be spreading. So independence movements in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, they got momentum after the war. Africa, colonization movement grew in Africa, and wartime demands which placed heavy burden on resources and manpower. It is also going to pave the way. End of colonial power will be there. First World War II will be marking the beginning of the end of the most European colonial powers, but they will be in fact coming up in some other way. Rise of new nations will be there across Asia and Africa, and the Cold War rivalry between US and USSR, it played out in the newly independent countries, and the new challenges will be there. And as far as India is concerned, India will be a great volunteer force of more than 2.5 million people will be there, which by 1945 playing a significant role in the Second World War. And financial contribution will be there because British are imposing taxes and levies on Indians, and actually India is actually financing the war which the British was fighting, and it was not of their business. There will be 75,000 Indian soldiers who will be actually captured by the Axis powers during the war. You can say India's contribution was immense. National struggle for independence also intensified, and the Quit India movement, and later on other kind of small movements will be there in India, and Royal Indian Navy mutiny will be the last coffin. Bengal famine will be there, catastrophic famine, which also again will be creating great empathy and restlessness among Indians. They wanted to be free. And the war hastened the end of colonial empires and paved the way for India's freedom. So what the question is, whose responsibility was the Second World War? The Versailles Treaty have been blamed for its harsh treatment against the Germans, which fueled the desire for revenge. League of Nations and idea of collective security have been criticized because it failed and nobody was serious with it, and the idea of general armament was never actually practiced. World economic crisis only fueled these existing problems by the depression of 1929, but it was something more than by the end of 1938, Germany's grievances had been removed. Repressions were largely cancelled, disarmament clauses had been ignored, Rhineland was remilitarized, Austria, Germany were united, and 3.5 Germans were brought into Reich from Czechoslovakia. German was a great power again, and this power was going to be very, very much difficult to handle. Appeasement was largely responsible for the deterioration of peace. Britain and France should have taken a firm line before Germany or Hitler, because it was very important that before Hitler became very strong, it was to be stopped. After the Munich Pact, Hitler was so convinced that the Britain and France would remain passive again, and that is why he decided to gamble on short war with Poland. So was it a strategic mistake by Britain and France? As Poland was difficult for Britain and France to defend and militarily much weaker than the industrialized Czechoslovakia. So British and foreign policy before 1939 was governed primarily by the idea of national self-interest and their own appeasement, only secondly by the moral considerations. They were actually immoral powers. USSR had been accused of making war inevitable by signing non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, again raising the eyebrows, which also included a secret agreement for Poland to be partitioned between Germany and USSR. Allied could not trust Soviet because they were communists. So that's how situation is going to be disastrous. So the disarmament of Czechoslovakia by Nazi Germany and Hungary and Poland after the Munich Agreement is one of the reasons. And the sequence of events, as we just said, that Sudetenland becoming part of Germany, Poland annexes Franz-Olza, an area with a Polish plurality, border area, and southern, Carpathian with Hungarian minorities become part of Hungary as the part of the first Vienna Award of 1938, and then again German invading remaining Czech territories, and finally Germany establishing protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and by 1940, or you can say March 1939, pro-Hitler Catholic fascist government declares Slovak Republic. So these events were changing, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as I just shown you over here in the map also, it's very important. Please note down and also make a note of it. But can we blame Hitler completely? A brilliant opportunist, taking advantage of mistakes of the appeasers and of the events such as the crisis in Czechoslovakia in 1939 by attacking Poland on all fronts instead of merely occupying Danzig and the corridor. Hitler showed that he wanted to destroy Poland. In this point of view, stated in the Mein Kampf, Germany would acquire Lebensraum, but it could only be achieved by a major war with Slavs, including Russians. He hoped to keep the war with Poland localized and to turn the main campaign, that is the destruction of USSR. That's what he believed. But he failed to realize that as far as Britain and France were concerned, the attack on Poland was one step too far. So War of 1939 was a mistake. The result on both sides was the diplomatic blunders. Hitler was creation of Germany history of reunification and expansionist mindset. He came with the state of, he came with the support and cooperation and also uh, great support by the people of Germany. Until 1937, Nazi foreign policy, I should say, was conservative and nationalistic. But after that, he embarked on an ambitious expansionist policy. This war was different because of its racial character, unlike the one in 1914 and 18. It culminated in a genocidal war that is called Holocaust, destruction of Jews, communist and other Slav groups who were considered as inferior to the German master race. And this was for the establishment of Great Germany, and for that, war was very important with Russia and not a world war. That is what Hitler believed. From 1936, when the four-year plan was introduced, and until 1939, in which two-thirds of the all investment in industry was producing war materials and one-fourth of the workforce employed in the military industry, it was unmatched and unseen for any power. And the problem was that German industry was running short of raw materials due to depleting foreign exchanges caused by tariffs by the Allies. So, anti-Semitism, that means you are hating Jews, you are creating a bad mindset, and also you are actually against them socially, politically, culturally. Hitler and the Nazis were the prominent of brutal anti-Semitism from the beginning of Mein Kampf, in which he termed them as un-German, or you can say subhuman. 1935 Nuremberg laws identified Jews as the subjects but not citizens and banned them from professions and restricted their movement and also intermarriages, sexual relation between Jews and non-Jews. So official anti-Semitism became violent in November 1938 with Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Nazi SS looted Jewish shops, houses and rounded up lakhs to be sent to concentration camps. Like in Treblinka, Auschwitz, they were established and the Holocaust began with the mass killings of Jews in Germany. And you can say German, which occupied certain Soviet territory, also there also it happened. The final solution to the Jews was to take form of annihilation, which was accelerated in 1942. It is believed and we know that more than 6 million Jews were killed. This economic destruction and huge loss of human lives because more than 40 million people were killed. So the numbers were so huge because this was the first time in which civilians were deliberately and systematically targeted. The German aerial attacks on London, Coventry, and to the Allied firebombing of Dresden, Tokyo, to the Nazis' systematic liquidation of Warsaw in 1944, to the nuclear incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nothing had seen the world before. But with the death of Hitler and Mussolini in 1945 and the Stalin in 1953, totalitarianism was no longer a force in Europe. The policy of genocide was defined as crime against humanity, and sense of common values and morality was put in picture. Due to aerial bombing, large part of Germany's industries and major cities laid in ruins. Similar conditions prevailed throughout Europe. Most notorious was the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were deliberately killed. So there was no, one can say, there was no all-inclusive peace settlement due to the distrust between USSR, and we can say that after the war, so many and there were so many treaties were signed because Italy lost her African colonies, gave up her claims on Albania and Ethiopia. USSR took the eastern section of Czechoslovakia, held on to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which they occupied till 1939. Japan agreed to surrender all acquired territory and complete withdrawal from China. Important social changes also took place, and after the war, millions of people were forced to move from their homes, and people were actually understanding that now life will not be same because worst cases were seen in Germany, Russia, and Poland. And in the German speaking areas in Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, there will be chaos. In countries like USSR and Germany, extensive urban redevelopment will be taking place, and the ruined cities had to be rebuilt from scratch. War also caused production of nuclear weapons, and the world was left under the threat of nuclear war, which might well have destroyed the entire planet, although it acted as a deterrent between the major powers. So the European domination of the rest of the world, it ended. Hegemony of USSR and US started. The economy of Big Four, that is France, Britain, Italy, and Germany, was in sorry state. Britain has an overseas debt of more than one can say 3,000 million pounds, and was dependent on the US. Emergence of the superpower is there, as I just said, and US had suffered relatively little from the war, enjoyed great prosperity and from supplying other allies with more material than food, and rivalry of these two superpowers in the Cold War and after 1945 was constant threat to the world peace. So decolonization, as I just said, was another element, and this is going to be, you can say, a movement towards decolonization. And Europeans, when they were defeated by Chinese in Asia, Japanese in Asia, it destroyed the tradition of European superiority and invincibility. Asian people also got independence, and they also got their own self-realization, and the struggle continued in many countries in Africa. So this is was going through 1960s, 1970s, and Land movement also started by 1960s. You can read more when you see the NCRT, that is the contemporary world. A very beautiful chapters are there. These chapters are going to help you in understanding these events better. UN was also formed as a successor of League of Nations, and the idea was to maintain peace on the whole, and it has been more or less successful or not. That is what you have to decide because UPSC is going to ask you the same question. So, foreign policy of Nazi Germany, we have seen formation of Berlin, Rome, Tokyo axis, we have seen Spanish Civil War, element system, elements of system in Hitler's foreign policy. Hitler did not really want a world war. We have discussed that also. We have discussed policy of appeasement. We have discussed Czechoslovakia. We have discussed the battle of the Second World War was exclusively European Atlantic. We have also discussed until December 1941 the battle of the Second World War was exclusive European Atlantic, because these questions came up again in 2000 and 2018. And Second World War was the history's most destructive war. That also we have discussed until 1941. The battlefield of the Second World War was again, this is coming up for the third time in the examination. And the effectiveness of League of Nations to prevent and check Japanese aggression against China was the first serious blow. Show how Spanish Civil War was a prelude to the Second World War. Manchurian crisis decided the fate of League of Nations. Germany was officially asked to attack the East and return for peace in the West. It is a comment question, and a well-motivated Italian invasion of Abyssinia in October 1935 demonstrated the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations of the League. So these ideas and questions are going to help you to complete command over this section, and that is only way as a part of the program that you have to write answers, you have to show it to me, and then you have to go on creating small understanding of the whole thing on your own, because the heart of lamb of Czechoslovakia was butchered in the midnight by a knife supplied by Chamberlain. The great failure of peace settlement was that it left Germans with a sense of resentment and grievance, as we have discussed already. And do you agree with the view that Treaty of Versailles was a bad compromise between a treaty based on force and a treaty based on ideas? So all previous year questions you have to see, we have discussed somehow here and there, little bit whatever is remaining. Just try to Google, just try to have search, and then we are through with the idea and also understanding along with the revision, so as you to become a successful future officer. Thank you very much. Ansarkari series is going to help you to get a complete command over world history.